Next news topic. I'm not entirely sure it's actually news as such because I'm pretty sure Guerrilla has made similar comments in the past. But basically, they've drawn a line. Guerrilla Games has drawn a line on the Killzone franchise. They say they're quote unquote done with Killzone. They've moved on to Horizon. They've said that as a studio, we needed to refresh the palette. They're done, 3 Killzone games. It was time to move on. And yeah, that's basically it. It's the end of Killzone. I'm kind of split on this one because I do think that there was much to commend the games. There was much more potential left. And I think it's fair enough if Guerrilla Games wanted to move on. But I don't think there's any reason why the franchise couldn't continue. What do you think about this one, John?
Uh, I'm not sure that the Killzone name really means that much at this point. It was held up as like a Halo killer initially, and then it was held up to that Killzone 2 graphics demo. They made good games with it, but I more realistically what I would like to see is Guerrilla Games tackling a first person shooter again. It's not necessarily Killzone. And I think they almost kind of did that with Killzone Shadowfall, which I still maintain is criminally underrated, and that people approach that game like Killzone, and it doesn't really play like the old Killzone titles at all. Where traditionally Killzone 1 through 3, they're very, dare I say, they follow a formula similar to Call of Duty, where it's like you're going through a bunch of scripted sequences and things happen around you and you're just reacting and shooting your way through it. And that those can be fun. It's a cool shooting gallery, but Shadowfall was a more tactical game that seemed like their attempt at doing something more like a Crisis versus Call of Duty. And I think there was a lot of potential there. I think artistically and just conceptually that was such an interesting game, and I would like to see them tackle that idea again, but not as a launch game. Give them the time they need to make it happen. That would be cool. But I think it's pretty obvious that for now they're sticking with Horizon, and I guess that's okay. I'm kind of ready for them to move on already. Like there's been enough Horizon around at this point that I don't really feel like I need any more. Like between the two games, they're big, and like the surprise reveals of those games, it's known now, right? Like the story is known. I don't really think there's much more they can do there that would be as impactful. I would like to see them move on, but I don't think they will anytime soon because Horizon does seem to be fairly successful, right?
It does seem so. Oliver.
Yes, I mean, I think this is unfortunate because the Killzone games, I thought they were very good. I especially liked Killzone 2 and 3 in particular. At the time, they were a little bit formulaic, but I think looking back, now that single-player shooters are a dying breed, I think that like a revival wouldn't be that bad of an idea here. I know that like Horizon kind of open world stat building RPG is a much more dominant form of game these days. But like something like Killzone that's like an 8-hour campaign and a pretty casual multiplayer offering, I think that might be pretty interesting and pretty good and actually a little bit refreshing nowadays, weirdly. The closest analog we have is something like Call of Duty, but that's like an 8-hour campaign plus like the world's most fervently followed multiplayer offering ever with a ton of content and stuff like that. So it's not quite the same thing. I do understand there's a strong commercial imperative to produce a game that has a really broad appeal in order to justify a $200 million budget. And I definitely sympathize with the Guerrilla Games comments here that expanding that market and having a game that is appealing to all players is very important. And then there's like a web of decisions that comes out of that, I feel like the fact that we're seeing this Lego Horizon Adventures game, the fact that we have that remaster, the fact they're talking about a TV show now, that's kind of, it all feeds into this beast that's this $200 million AAA title or $300 million AAA title, because otherwise it really isn't sustainable, absent that. But I mean, I'd love to see something like a Killzone 5 that's like $80 million or something. They put it together. It's a simple solo shooter. Maybe it has some bigger environments. Maybe they do some interesting things with it, but it doesn't need to be this gigantic kind of title. And I'd hope that's something that maybe they're not looking at now, but maybe in the future they could take a look at, or maybe another studio could take a look at, because I don't know, I kind of feel like maybe with older players especially, if you bring back this kind of 360 era style of title, format of title, maybe you could get some eyeballs on something that's a little bit different from what we see nowadays, even if that thing is a little bit formulaic relative to the standards of 15 years ago, perhaps.
Interesting. My opinion on this is that there's obviously question marks over the franchise, right? As to whether it should actually be brought back. I mean, Sony is a business. It's drawn by revenues and profits. I'm assuming that they've looked at the sales of Killzone Shadowfall and realized, well, you know, we've got a studio like Guerrilla Games. They should actually be doing something more meaningful. Something, you know, that they want to do, and that's great for us from a business perspective, right? However, I do think that there is, dare I say it, a brand equity to Killzone. I do think people look back on it with a certain degree of nostalgia. You know, Killzone 2, 3, really good games. Shadowfall, as you say, John, criminally underappreciated. And, you know, Shadowfall, I've been thinking about the whole Horizon remaster situation with Nixxes, and what could Nixxes do if they were given
oh my gosh,
Killzone Shadowfall?
Let them polish it up a bit, because, you know, it had some issues being a launch game. Release a PC version of it. Like, there's so much you could do there. It's such an interesting game. Yeah, and, you know, basically just see what the reaction is. I mean, I'm assuming based on Horizon Zero Dawn Remaster's $10 upgrade option, which I suspect a lot of people will be using as opposed to paying full price for the whole thing. I'm suspecting that the actual cost of that kind of project is probably quite manageable. And it probably would be similar with Killzone Shadowfall, if not cheaper even. So, you know, at some point, I think you've got to give it a punt. I mean, I was looking online to see how many copies Killzone Shadowfall sold. I'm not sure to the extent which this figure is accurate, but it seems to be 2.1 million according to the all-seeing eye that is Wikipedia. And I do think they could probably actualize a lot more revenue from that game, because it is fundamentally a good game, and, you know, PlayStation 5 would be a great venue for it, 5 Pro, and PC, of course. And it needn't be an expensive game, you know, a punt, so to speak. You know, they could take a punt on it to see what to do next. As to whether Guerrilla needs to be involved, well, they don't have to be involved, but, you know, they're constantly evolving the Decima engine. If it was Decima powered, that would work. So, yeah, I mean, I'd like to see more. I guess, John, the one sort of redeeming factor about all of this is that Shadowfall actually shipped with the ability to run the game with an unlocked frame rate, which means instant 60 frames per second on PlayStation 5. Yeah, that ended up being a fun bonus, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I'll tell you what, whenever we talk about it, you know, whenever we sort of point out that, hey, you can play Killzone Shadowfall at 60 frames per second, there's definitely a positive response to that. You know, people are like, wow, this is great.
I feel like I want to do a retrospective video on that at some point, because there's just there's so many ideas in there that are just so cool. Man, what an interesting thing. But still, the Killzone IP itself, I think it's ultimately lacking one thing that makes it easier to bring back, and that's characters. Most people don't like any of the characters in those games. I mean, how many? I guess there's probably some Rico fans out there, maybe. Most people don't care about any of those characters. They like the iconography and the design, the art direction, but there's no characters to it that are really memorable.
I don't think that Killzone has like iconic individual characters, but I think like the Hellgast and the kind of industrial environments, like that's all pretty iconic to me, I think, especially from that second game, which really pushed that aesthetic so hard for the time, for 2009. Coming on the wake of that, of course, that important reveal trailer. I mean, I just love to see, obviously, Shadowfall would be great to see on PS5 in an enhanced form, but I'd also just love to see 2 and 3, those PS3 titles. That's personally what I'm interested in, because those are titles that are not available in the modern PSN infrastructure. They're not available on PS5, maybe through streaming. I don't know, I haven't looked it up, maybe through streaming, but obviously not as a native PS5 title. And use that to gauge interest a bit. Bring back some of those older titles, maybe not all of them, maybe not like Killzone 1 and Liberation. I mean, possibly, I'm not opposed to that, obviously. But bring those titles back, gauge audience interest. If there is audience interest,
the remaster, remember, of Killzone 1.
That for PS3, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think you can play that on PS5 through streaming, actually. But again, not the same. But I mean, I think, like, to me, if I was to pick one Killzone game that's kind of that, like, titular, iconic Killzone title that people are, really taken by, it's probably Killzone 2, in my opinion, just because of when that came out, what it represented, its visual splendor, like the destruction, the particles, the incredible environment, the atmosphere, the shadow casting lights from the gun and all this stuff, the shadow casting muzzle flashes. I think it's just like such an iconic and interesting game. And I'd love to see it again on PS5, but I really do think that game is just something special. And I think if you brought it back, it would probably cause a bit of a wave of people being interested in that series again. So maybe that's something they could approach in the future.
Muzzle flash shadows. I can just see Alex's ears pricking up at the sound of that.